Imagine getting hit with a $500 fine, just for fishing in your own neighborhood lake.
Sounds crazy, right?
That's exactly what happened to me, Mason Holloway, a veteran and software engineer who thought he'd found peace in a gated community. But when the HOA banned fishing without telling me, I fought back, hard. I bought the lake myself, shut down access, and sparked a neighborhood revolt that ended with the HOA president resigning. This isn't just a story about fishing, it's about standing up to bullies and taking control when the system fails you. Stay tuned, because you won't believe how far this went. I wish I was joking. It was one of those perfect, quiet Saturday mornings. The sun had just started to rise, casting soft golden light over the lake that bordered my property. Birds chirped lazily from the trees, and the water shimmered like a sheet of glass. For me, this was peace, pure and uninterrupted.
Juste me, my rod, and the stillness of nature.
I'd fished this lake dozens of times over the years without a single issue. It wasn't just a hobby, it was therapy.
I live in a neighborhood called Silver Pine. Sounds fancy, right?
It's a gated community with neatly trimmed lawns, matching mailboxes, and of course, a homeowners association. I never paid them much mind. I kept my grass tidy, parked where I was supposed to, and generally stayed out of everyone's business. In return, I expected the same courtesy. Unfortunately, I was wrong. That Saturday, I cast my line into the water just after 6 a.m. A gentle mist floated above the lake, and the only sounds were the soft plunk of my bait and the occasional rustle of squirrels. It felt like a slice of heaven. Around 7:30, I reeled in a decent-sized bass, not a record breaker, but definitely dinner-worthy. I admired it for a moment before placing it in my cooler. That's when I heard the unmistakable crunch of gravel under expensive shoes.
Excuse-me, came a sharp voice behind me.
I turned to find Evelyn Richardson, the president of our HOA, standing at the edge of my property. Clipboard in hand, perfectly ironed blouse, and an expression like she'd just stepped in something foul. "You're not allowed to fish here," she said flatly. I blinked. "I'm on my own property. The lake is right behind my house." "The lake is common property. HOA managed," she snapped. "And fishing is prohibited unless approved in writing."
I almost logged.
"I've been fishing here for years. No one's ever said anything." "Well, you've been violating the rules for years," she said, scribbling something on her clipboard. "You'll be receiving a fine." I thought she was bluffing. Surely, no one could be so petty. I was wrong, again. The notice arrived 2 days later, violation 7B12, unauthorized fishing on HOA-controlled lakefront property.
Fine, $500. Payable within 14 days.
I stared at the paper in disbelief. $500.
For catching a single fish. No warning, no discussion, juste a fat fin and a smug signature at the bottom. Evelyn Richardson.
I called the HOA office, thinking this had to be a mistake. The receptionist barely let me finish explaining before she said, "If you want to contest the fine, you'll have to request a hearing. But just so you know, fishing violations aren't usually overturned." I felt my blood pressure rising. I was fishing behind my own house. "Common property," she repeated like a robot. "Even if it's behind your house." That's when it hit me, this wasn't about a fish. It was about control. Evelyn and her HOA minions wanted everyone to toe the line, even if it meant policing something as harmless as fishing at sunrise. I'd stayed quiet for years, never challenged their nonsense rules, never asked questions. But this was different. This was personal. I didn't know it yet, but that $500 fine was the start of something much bigger. It would lead me down a path I never saw coming. They thought they could bully me with rules and fines. They thought I'd pay up, shut up, and move on. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Because I wasn't going to let it go. Not this time. Not for a fish.
Let me backtrack for a second. My name is Mason Holloway.
I'm 38 years old, a veteran of the U.S. Army, and I now work full-time as a remote software engineer. I've spent most of my life on the move: barracks, base housing, temporary rentals, apartments in noisy cities. But after years of service and an honorable discharge, I finally wanted to plant some roots.
I wanted quoi?
Stability. A place that actually felt like home. That's how I ended up in Willow Ridge Lakeside. The name itself sounds serene, doesn't it?
Willow Ridge Lakezid. Like a brochure's dream.
It's a gated community tucked outside a medium-sized town, the kind of place where neighbors wave from their driveways, kids ride bikes in cul-de-sacs, and lawnmowers hum like a suburban symphony every Saturday morning. But for me, the main draw wasn't the neatly landscaped sidewalks or the security gate. It was the lake. You see, I grew up fishing with my grandfather. Long summers on his cabin's dock, listening to stories about his time in Korea, learning how to tie the perfect lure, and watching the sun rise through the misty morning fog. Fishing was never just a pastime for me. It was a bond, a memory, and later, a way to clear my head after long deployments and longer nights of coding. It's where I found calm. So when I found the listing for a 2-story home with direct lake access in Willow Ridge Lakeside, I couldn't believe my luck. The backyard sloped gently toward the water, with trees arching overhead and just enough space for a small dock. The real estate agent practically sang the neighborhood's praises, and when she mentioned the lake was great for light recreation, I asked specifically about fishing. "Oh, totally," she'd said, waving a manicured hand like it was no big deal.
People fish all the time.
"You've got lake access, so enjoy it." I was sold. I used most of my savings for the down payment, moved in a month later, and finally felt like I could exhale. The house wasn't huge, but it was mine. It had a quiet office with a view of the water, a fireplace I'd never used but liked having, and that gorgeous backyard that led straight to the lake. For the first year, it was everything I hoped it would be. I settled into my remote work routine, writing code in the mornings, hopping on video calls with my team, and fishing in the early hours before the world woke up.
No city traffic, no late night sirens, no landlord or upstairs neighbor. Just the sound of frog at night, birds in the morning, and the occasional splash of a bass breaking the surface of the water.
And while I was aware of the Homeowners Association, I didn't think much of it at first. I skimmed through the welcome packet, paid my dues on time, and figured that was the end of it. Sure, they had some strange rules: no non-neutral exterior paint colors, no satellite dishes, no lawn ornaments over 2 feet tall, but I kept to myself and didn't ruffle any feathers. I wasn't interested in drama. I just wanted peace. But looking back now, I can see the signs were there.
The warning letters, some neighbor good for leaving garbage quand out à des Toulon.
The passive-aggressive notes about holiday decorations. The way HOA President Evelyn Richardson would patrol the neighborhood like a mall cop on a power trip, always clutching her clipboard like it was a badge of honor. I didn't think much of it then. But now? Now I realize that lake, the very reason I bought the house, wasn't just water and trees to them. It was a symbol of control. A tool. A leash they could tighten whenever they pleased. And the moment I cast that fishing line, I tugged too hard on that leash. And they yanked back. Hard. The more I thought about it, the more frustrated I became. Nowhere, and I mean nowhere, in the welcome packet, the community bylaws, the HMA website, or the handful of quarterly meetings I attended did it say anything about fishing being banned. Nothing. Not a single sentence. Not even a vague reference. You'd think if something as basic as casting a line into the lake was forbidden, they'd make that abundantly clear. You'd think they'd maybe post a sign. Or, at the very least, send a memo. But there was nothing. Zilch. And I'm the kind of guy who reads the fine print. Comes from being both a veteran and a software engineer. I don't like surprises, especially the kind that come with $500 penalties attached. So, I pulled out my HMA welcome packet. It was still in the original binder they gave me when I moved in, tucked away in a filing cabinet in my home office. I flipped through the neatly labeled tabs: community guidelines, architectural restrictions, amenities usage, bylaws, but there was no mention of any lake restrictions that included fishing. I logged into the HMA portal next. They have this password-protected website for residents, where you can pay dues, file maintenance requests, or read community updates. I searched fishing, lake access, and even broader terms like recreation, but the results came up empty. One forum post from 2 years ago asked if fishing was allowed and got no official response, just a few neighbors saying they'd fished without issue. So what was the problem now? And then there was the location itself. I wasn't in someone else's yard. I wasn't on a private dock or inside a roped-off area. I was standing on what the HOA calls a shared community shoreline, which borders my backyard. According to the original neighborhood plat map, my property ends just before the waterline, and that thin strip of grass between my yard and the lake is technically communal. But here's the thing: everyone uses it. People walk their dogs along it. Kids skip stones from it. Teens set up blankets for picnics or late-night stargazing. So why was I the one being punished?
Il y a da théorie, Evelyn Richardson.
I've seen her eye me for months now, usually from a distance, as if waiting for me to slip up. Maybe it's the fact that I keep to myself. Maybe it's because I didn't join any of the social committees or attend every HOA meeting. Maybe she just didn't like veterans, or guys with beards who don't smile during potlucks. Who knows? But this fine felt personal. And I wasn't going to accept it quietly. The next day, I printed out every relevant page from the HOA guidelines and highlighted the parts about community land use. Nothing mentioned fishing. Nothing even implied it. I took photos of the shoreline, showing how public it really was. I even recorded a short video of myself walking the boundary with my phone, narrating as I pointed out how other people clearly used the space for recreation. Then I drafted a formal letter contesting the fine. It was firm but polite, military professionalism with just a hint of don't mess with me energy. I attached my evidence, cited the relevant documents, and emailed it directly to the HOA board, copying Evelyn for good measure. I figured that would settle it. A misunderstanding, maybe. An overreach by a zealous HOA president who got a little too clipboard happy. Surely once they saw the lack of evidence, they'd retract the fine. But instead of backing down, they doubled down. 2 days later, I received an email, "Your violation stands. Fishing is not permitted from community property without prior written authorization. Further violations may result in additional fines." That was the moment the switch flipped in my head. This wasn't about a rule. This was about power. And if they wanted a fight over a fish, I was more than ready to give them one. I stared at the letter for a good 5 minutes, trying to convince myself I had read it wrong. But there it was in black and white, nestled neatly at the bottom of the page like it was just another line in a grocery list. Repeated violations may result in legal action. Legal action. For catching too largemouth bass. If I hadn't been so frustrated, I might have laughed. This was the kind of line you'd expect if I'd been running an underground dogfighting ring, not casually fishing behind my house. The sheer absurdity of it would have been funny if it wasn't so threatening. That warning hit differently. It wasn't just a fine anymore. It was a shot across the bow. A message. This was the HOA saying, "We're watching you. Step out of line again, and we'll make your life hell." At that point, it became clear that this was no longer about rules or bylaws or some ambiguous clause buried in a 50-page community handbook. This was personal. This was about someone, probably Evelyn Richardson, flexing her authority. Trying to make an example out of me for daring to live outside the HOA's narrow comfort zone. And frankly, that kind of authoritarian nonsense never sat well with me. I've faced a lot in my life. I've dealt with chain-of-command bureaucracy in the military, fought through long deployments in hostile environments, and navigated the fast-paced world of tech deadlines and system crashes. I've had colleagues who micromanaged every keystroke and commanding officers who barked over spilled coffee. But none of them held a candle to Evelyn and her HOA goon squad. The morning after I got the letter, I stood in my backyard with a cup of coffee, staring out at the lake. The same water I had always considered peaceful now looked like contested territory. I spotted the tiny security camera mounted near the community walking trail, pointed conveniently toward the shoreline. I'd never paid attention to it before. Now I wondered if it had caught me pulling up that second base. I wondered how long they'd been watching me. That same day, I got a second envelope in the mail, this one thinner, but no less irritating. A reminder notice from the HOA informing me that my lawn had minor unevenness along the eastern property edge. Not a violation, they clarified, yet, but something I should address to maintain community aesthetics. Sure. My lawn. Because that was definitely the most pressing concern at the moment. I started seeing things differently after that. I noticed Evelyn walking her dog past my house twice a day instead of once. I noticed a board member I barely knew suddenly showing up at the walking path whenever I stepped outside. I even caught a couple of teenagers, Evelyn's grandkids, I later learned, pointing their phones at my property like they were on a recon mission.
Paranoia?
Maybe. But I didn't think so. This was coordinated. It was subtle, sure, passive-aggressive in that polished suburban way, but it was harassment, plain and simple.
All over affiche.
Or rather, over my refusal to bow to the imaginary crown Evelyn wore every time she wielded that HOA rulebook like scripture. The fine wasn't meant to punish me. It was meant to scare me. And when I didn't fold, the escalation began. I wasn't just the guy who fished on community property anymore. I was a problem.
A dit santé. A threat to the fragile control Evelyn helt over this picture-perfect neighborhood.
But here's the thing about threats. They work best on people who are afraid. And I wasn't afraid. If they wanted a legal war, they were going to get one. But first, I had to figure out how deep this rabbit hole went. And as it turned out, it went a lot deeper than anyone expected. If you've never lived in an HOA neighborhood, let me introduce you to the monarch of mine. Her name is Evelyn Richardson. She's the president of the Willow Ridge Lakeside Homeowners Association, and she rules it with a kind of iron grip usually reserved for third-world dictators and Fortune 500 CEOs. She's the type of person who introduces herself by title, Evelyn Richardson, president of the HOA, like that actually carries legal weight outside the block. And the worst part? She truly believes it does. Evelyn is in her early 60s, with a wardrobe that screams retired corporate middle management, and a voice that could strip paint off a fence. You'll never see her without her clipboard, her oversized sunglasses, and that tight, polite smile that says, "I'm judging you within an inch of your life, but I'll do it with grace and a coupon for baked goods." People in the neighborhood jokingly call her the Queen of Willow Ridge. Others go with the Warden, or Her Highness. But none of the jokes feel like real jokes anymore. There's truth beneath the sarcasm, and everyone knows it. Because Evelyn doesn't run the HOA like a volunteer community board. She runs it like a kingdom. She handpicks her allies, board members who agree with her on everything and know better than to challenge her authority. The monthly meetings aren't democratic discussions. They're carefully choreographed performances. Motions pass before they're even fully read aloud, and any resident who dares to speak up during the public comment section is met with icy stares and condescending reminders about time limits and procedural order. Disagree with Evelyn? Prepare to find a violation notice on your door the next morning. I've seen it happen. One neighbor dared to question the ban on political signs during an election year. Suddenly, he was fined for excessive lawn clutter, even though he only had a small flag and a gnome in his flower bed. Another couple painted their shutters a slightly darker shade of navy than approved. They were summoned to an emergency compliance meeting and forced to repaint at their own expense. No one was safe. Not even the old lady down the street who kept bird feeders in her front yard. Evelyn deemed them unsightly and claimed they attracted raccoons. You get the idea. For the most part, the residents grumble, roll their eyes, and play along. Why? Because they don't want the headache. They don't want the fines. They don't want Evelyn's clipboard of doom coming down on them. I was the same way, at first. I kept my lawn trimmed, didn't throw loud parties, waved politely during her morning patrols. I stayed in line. But the second I cast that fishing line into the lake, I stepped into her crosshairs.
And Evelyn doesn't forget.
She's the kind of person who keeps mental files on everyone. Who notices which house didn't hang wreaths for the winter holidays. Who writes down which residents showed up to the community potluck without bringing a dish. To her, control isn't just a responsibility, it's a passion project. It's not about the lake. It's not about the fish. It's about authority. She sees Willow Ridge as her domain, and the HOA as her instrument of power. And now she sees me, Mason Holloway, veteran, tech guy fisherman, as a threat to that power. And I suppose in a way, I am.
Because he don't kneel.
Not to a title.
Not to intimidation.
And definitely not to someone who thinks a clipboard gives them the right to dictate how I live on my own property.
If Evelyn want a power struggle, fine.
But she'd better understand something. I don't fight to win.
He fight until the other side never want to fight again.
I'm not the kind of guy who jumps straight to war. Despite what some people might assume, especially people like Evelyn, I don't go looking for fights.
He believe in talking first.
In giving people the benefit of the doubt. In resolving issues like adults. So when I got that second warning letter, after the fine, after the ridiculous threat of legal action, I decided I'd do things the civilized way. I put on a clean button-down, printed copies of my appeal and supporting documents, and showed up early to the next HOA meeting. I even brought muffins from the local bakery. You know, a peace offering. The meeting was held in the clubhouse near the main entrance of the neighborhood, a cozy little space with plastic folding chairs and a coffee urn that hadn't been cleaned in at least 3 presidencies. The board sat at a long table up front, papers stacked neatly, microphones unused and purely decorative. Evelyn, of course, was seated dead center, clipboard in front of her, lips pursed in that way that made her look like she had just sucked on a lemon. I waited patiently as they went through the usual routine: community landscaping updates, pool maintenance, someone complaining about teen loitering near the tennis courts. Then came the resident concerns portion of the meeting. That was my moment. I stood up, walked to the podium, and calmly introduced myself. Mason Holloway, 113 Brookside Way, I said, projecting my voice without being confrontational. I'm here to address a recent fine I received for fishing from the shoreline behind my property. Evelyn's eyebrows lifted. I could see it in her face. She was ready for this. I reviewed the community bylaws thoroughly, I continued, holding up the neatly marked pages. There is no mention of a fishing ban from the community shoreline. In fact, the term fishing doesn't appear at all in the rules provided to residents, online or in print. I'd like clarification, and if possible, for this fine to be dismissed based on a lack of documented violation. It was a fair, measured request. For a few seconds, the room was quiet. A couple of neighbors nodded. One board member looked awkwardly at Evelyn. Then she spoke. With a little smirk that made my blood boil. "Rules are rules," she said casually, tapping her pen against her clipboard. "Perhaps you didn't read the full set of bylaws. Fishing is not permitted without prior authorization from the board. It's implied under our environmental and safety clauses." Implied? I asked, still keeping my voice steady. "You're fining residents based on implied rules now?" She didn't answer that. Instead, she leaned forward and said, "If you have a concern, feel free to submit it in writing. This meeting is not a courtroom." "I did submit it in writing," I said, holding up the letter I had already emailed and mailed twice. It was ignored.
She gave at un smile.
"We have discretion. And you were in violation."
End of discussion.
And that was it.
No débat. No considération.
No vote. Just Evelyn's word, and the board falling in line like trained lapdogs. I sat back down, fists clenched in my lap, while they moved on to the next agenda item like nothing had happened. Like I was just another troublemaker to swat away. That moment sealed it for me. I had come in good faith. Respectful. Reasonable. And I had been mocked. Dismissed. She didn't care about right or wrong. She didn't care about facts.
Evelyn cared about control.
Well, she could keep her little podium and her smug smile. Because if she wasn't going to listen when I talked, she'd sure as hell listen when I acted. After getting stonewalled at the HMA meeting, I knew I had 2 options: drop it or dig in. So I dug in. I'm a software engineer by trade. My job, and frankly my personality, is built around figuring out how things work.
Système.
Processes. Code. So when Evelyn smugly told me to read the bylaws, I took her advice. But not the way she intended. I didn't just skim them, I dissected them. I spent the next 2 nights going line by line through the official Willow Ridge Lakeside HOA documents. I pulled up archived versions of the website, reviewed public meeting minutes, and even found a residents-only Dropbox folder from the real estate company that sold me the house. What I found was enlightening. First off, the original bylaws, the ones filed when Willow Ridge was established, were surprisingly reasonable. Standard stuff: noise ordinances, lawn maintenance, restrictions on visible trash bins, that kind of thing.
Nothing out of the ordinary.
But then I found the updates. Tucked away in a poorly formatted PDF labeled Amendments, June, I found a series of new restrictions passed just 3 months before I moved in. And there it was, plain as day, in small font under Section 8B, Environmental Conduct. Recreational fishing is prohibited from any and all common areas, including but not limited to the lake, shoreline, and greenbelt spaces. Enforcement shall be at the discretion of the HMA board. No public vote. No community discussion. Just a quiet amendment passed at a board meeting that had only 2 homeowners in attendance, neither of whom, I later learned, were even aware of what had been voted on. The meeting minutes didn't include the actual text of the amendment, only a vague bullet point: motion to update common area usage policies, passed unanimously. That was their fishing ban.
Snuck in like a thief in the night.
But here's the kicker: they never notified new homeowners. When I bought my house, I was handed a welcome packet by the realtor, standard HOA info, contacts, pool hours, and a printed version of the original bylaws. Not the updated ones. Not a single mention of recent amendments.
No addendum. No disclosure.
Nothing. Legally? That's a huge problem. Most states have laws requiring HOAs to disclose all current governing documents to new residents during the sales process. Willow Ridge skipped that step entirely. Whether it was laziness or intentional concealment, it was a clear failure of transparency. And it meant I had been fined, and threatened with legal action, for breaking a rule I was never told existed. I started asking around. Quietly, at first. A few neighbors, mostly the ones who walked their dogs near the lake or had lived here longer than a year. Turns out, I wasn't the only one in the dark. No one I spoke to had ever received an update to the bylaws. Some didn't even know updates had happened. That changed the game. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. It was about how the HMA was operating, secretly, sloppily, and possibly illegally. I even found out that Evelyn and her board had voted on several other changes around the same time. Stricter lawn color codes, tighter parking rules, and a vague clause about unauthorized recreational activities that could be applied to just about anything they didn't like. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became: the bylaws were a joke. Not because rules don't matter, but because these rules were made behind closed doors, enforced selectively, and hidden from the very people they were supposed to govern. This wasn't governance. It was manipulation. And I don't do well with rigged systems. If Evelyn wanted to play queen, she could. But I was going to be the guy who read the fine print and flipped the whole script. When you're dealing with a bully who hides behind paperwork, you don't punch, you print.
You don't chew, you research.
And when the paperwork starts to look crooked, you lawyer up. After realizing the fishing ban had been slipped into the bylaws 3 months before I moved in, without so much as a whisper to new homeowners, I called up my friend Mike. He's a real estate attorney, sharp as hell, and not the kind of guy who dances around legal gray areas.
We served together back in the day.
Now, he spends most of his time wrestling with contracts and zoning disputes in a glassy office downtown. Let me guess, he said after I explained the situation. HOA board slipped in amendments without disclosure, didn't notify buyers, and now they're enforcing those changes like gospel. Bingo, I said. I see this crap all the time. Mike asked me to send over the documents, the welcome packet I received, the printed bylaws, the June amendment PDF I'd found buried online, and the violation notice they sent me. I had it all scanned and in his inbox before the end of the day. He called me back the next morning, coffee in one hand, legal pad in the other. Well, good news for you, he said. They're in violation of several disclosure statutes. According to Mike, most states, including ours, require HMAs to provide current and complete governing documents to all new homeowners at or before closing. That includes all bylaws, rules, amendments, and any pending changes under board review. If they fail to do that, enforcement of those rules is typically unenforceable against that homeowner until proper notice is given and documented. In short, I couldn't be fined for violating a rule they never told me existed. And there was more. The fine's void, Mike said, and if they try to escalate this, or fine you again, they're exposing themselves to a legal challenge. You've got a paper trail showing they never disclosed those amendments. That's a solid defense. You could even argue negligence or misrepresentation, depending on what the real estate agent knew. It was a relief, sure. But I wasn't interested in just wiping the slate clean. I wanted them to answer for this. I wanted Evelyn, and the lapdog board members who rubber-stamped her power grabs, to feel what it was like to be held accountable. Mike was on board. Let's draft a letter, he said. We did. It was a beautiful thing.
Professionnel. Direct.
Legal without being overbearing. It cited specific HOA statutes, state disclosure laws, and the HOA's own governing documents. It demanded that the $500 fine be rescinded, that any record of the violation be removed from my homeowner file, and that the board immediately cease enforcement of undisclosed amendments until proper notice had been given to all residents. We gave them 10 business days to respond. Mike sent the letter via certified mail and email. No way they could pretend they didn't get it. We also CC'd the property management company that worked with the HMA, just to make sure this didn't get quietly buried in Evelyn's inbox. The ball was in their court. And I knew Evelyn wasn't going to take this lying down. She'd built her little empire on people not pushing back. On residents being too busy, too polite, or too intimidated to challenge her. But I wasn't most people. I had proof, I had precedent, and now I had a lawyer. She wanted to play queen? Fine. But I just declared war, and I had the law on my side. With Mike's letter sent and my spirits high, I figured the HMA would back down. After all, the facts were on my side. The undisclosed bylaws, the state laws they'd ignored, it all painted them in a pretty bad light. I expected a quick resolution, maybe an apology or a simple withdrawal of the fine. But nope. What I got instead was a response that could only be described as pure Evelyn. The letter came in the mail about a week later. Same official HOA letterhead, same tone of thinly veiled condescension. I tore it open, expecting some kind of acknowledgement. Instead, it was a wall of denial and defiance. They doubled down. In fact, they accused me of threatening the safety of the lake ecosystem. Their exact words were something like this: "Mr. Holloway, your actions constitute a direct violation of our environmental protection policies. Recreational fishing, especially without board authorization, disrupts the natural balance of our shared lake and poses risks to local wildlife. Your disregard for these policies undermines our community's efforts to maintain a safe and sustainable environment. Further violations will result in immediate legal action." I stared at the letter in disbelief. Threatening the safety of the ecosystem, with a fishing pole? I had caught 2 largemouth bass. I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure catch-and-release fishing practiced responsibly doesn't qualify as environmental terrorism. Their claim was laughable. But it was also calculated. Evelyn was playing the environmental card to try and justify her iron-fisted control. She knew that accusing me of harming the lake would intimidate other residents into silence. It was a classic power move: disguise your personal vendetta as community concern. That letter was the final straw. Mike advised me to file a formal dispute with the HWA's internal grievance process. It wasn't just about my fine anymore, it was about standing up to bullying and unchecked authority. Filing the dispute was a process all its own. First, I had to draft a detailed account of the events, everything from the initial fine, the secret amendments, to the insulting response accusing me of endangering the environment. I attached copies of every relevant document: the original bylaws, the undisclosed amendments, my legal letter, and their response. I submitted my dispute in writing to the HMWA's designated grievance committee, per the procedures outlined in the bylaws. I also requested a formal hearing to present my case in front of the committee members. The hearing was scheduled for a few weeks later. I knew it wouldn't be a fair fight. Evelyn chaired the committee, of course. Her loyal supporters filled the room, board members who nodded at her every word and neighbors who looked like they'd been told to keep quiet or else. But I came prepared. I printed out charts about fish populations in local lakes, expert articles on catch-and-release fishing, and state wildlife protection laws that actually encouraged responsible recreational fishing. I even brought photos of the pristine lake environment and a log of my own catch history, showing that I practiced conservation. When my turn came, I spoke calmly and clearly. I pointed out their failure to notify residents of the fishing ban. I dismantled their environmental argument with facts and expert testimony. And I made it clear that their heavy-handed enforcement was more about control than conservation. The room was tense. Evelyn's face didn't betray any emotion, but I could tell I'd rattled the cage. By the end of the hearing, it was clear this was just the beginning. Evelyn and her board weren't going to back down. They were entrenched. And I was the new problem they didn't want. But for the first time, I wasn't just a frustrated homeowner. I was a challenger, armed with facts, law, and a determination that only grows stronger by the day. After the hostile hearing and the HOA doubling down on their nonsense, I sat in my living room late that night, replaying the whole mess in my head. The frustration was thick, but amid the anger, a thought started to take shape. A spark. A question. What if I could change the game entirely? See, I'd done some digging earlier while researching the bylaws and property boundaries. The lake, the one Evelyn and her cronies claimed to protect so fiercely, wasn't technically HOA property. It wasn't owned by the community association at all. The lake was owned by a private land trust. A land trust that leased usage rights to Willow Ridge Lakeside. In other words, The HMA didn't own the lake or the shoreline. They only had permission to use it, under strict terms set by the trust. That raised a fascinating question. Could someone buy that land? If the HMA wasn't the owner, maybe the residents weren't either. Maybe, just maybe, the lake and the surrounding shoreline could be purchased independently. The idea felt audacious.
Radical.
Maybe even crazy. But when you're backed into a corner by an organization that wields power without transparency or accountability, radical ideas become necessary. I started pulling records, property deeds, land trust filings, county tax assessor data, everything I could find online and in public records. It took a few days, and a few calls to the county office, but I finally uncovered the details. The Land Trust was a small non-profit organization called Greenway Watershed Trust. They managed several parcels around the area, including the lake and the public shorelines that Willow Ridge lakeside residents used daily. Their ownership was straightforward and clear. They held the title to the lake bed and the surrounding acreage, and they issued long-term leases to local entities, including the HOA. Here's the kicker. The Trust's mission was to protect natural resources, maintain the area's environmental health, and support public access where appropriate. But the leases had loopholes. Loopholes Evelyn and the HOA exploited to restrict access and ban activities like fishing. If I could buy the land or negotiate a new lease directly with the Trust, I might have a chance to wrest control away from the HOA's iron grip. The more I thought about it, the more the plan grew clearer. Owning the land would mean owning the rules. Not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood.
Imagine the power shift, no more secret banc.
No more hidden amendments. No more fines for enjoying the lake responsibly. The thought was intoxicating. I reached out to the Greenway Watershed Trust office the next morning. I introduced myself, a local homeowner concerned about the community's access and use of the lake. I asked about the possibility of purchasing parcels or renegotiating lease terms. The person on the other end was polite but cautious. The Trust's mission is protection and stewardship, she said. We're open to working with residents and organizations that support those goals. I left the call with a mix of hope and uncertainty. But I wasn't just waiting for permission. I started drafting a plan.
A plan to buy the lake and shoreline parcel from the Trust.
To reclaim the land from the HMA's unchecked authority. To restore access and freedom to the people who actually lived here. And maybe, just maybe, to close the loopholes that Evelyn exploited. That was when I realized something crucial. This wasn't just a fight over fishing fines anymore. It was a fight for control of our community's future. And I was ready to see it through. After that first call with the Greenway Watershed Trust, I knew I was onto something, but I wasn't ready to celebrate just yet. The idea of buying the lake and shoreline land felt bold, even reckless, to some people. But I'm not the kind of guy who backs down just because something sounds complicated. I looped Mike in again. If I was going to pull off something this big, I needed a professional by my side. Mike got to work, digging into public records, tracking down the exact owners of the land held by the Trust. Turns out, the property wasn't owned outright by the nonprofit, but was held in a private family trust, a kind of shell company that often holds real estate investments for estate planning purposes. The family behind the trust had owned the land for decades, but was now looking to liquidate some of their assets. It made sense. They were older, the paperwork was a mess, and they weren't particularly interested in maintaining a long-term relationship with the community or the HOA. We arranged a meeting through Mike with the family's trustee, an estate lawyer who managed their affairs. The initial conversation was surprisingly straightforward. They were open to selling. Not cheap, of course. This was prime waterfront property with a dedicated community of homeowners who relied on the lake for recreation and property value. But the trustee made it clear, the land was available for the right price. That was the break I needed. The trustee emphasized that the family had no allegiance to the HMA or its leadership, and their goal was simply to sell the asset cleanly and quickly. Mike and I started crunching numbers. What kind of offer would be reasonable? What was the market value of the land? How would the purchase impact the HMA's lease agreements? It quickly became clear that this was more than just a real estate deal. It was a strategic opportunity to shift power in the neighborhood. If I could acquire the lake and shoreline property, I'd effectively hold the key to how it was used. I'd be able to set terms for the HOA's access or even restrict it if Evelyn and her board continued their overreach. The thought sent a thrill through me. I drafted an initial offer letter, working closely with Mike to make sure every legal box was checked. We proposed a fair price, one that respected the property's value but reflected the urgency of the sale. The trustee took the offer to the family. Days passed. Then a call. They were interested. Negotiations began, back and forth over price, terms, contingencies. It was tense but productive. Meanwhile, Evelyn was still sending me nasty letters and threatening fines. She clearly didn't know what was coming. I kept the lake purchase plans quiet. Not just to avoid stirring the pot prematurely, but because I wanted to make sure I had the deal locked down before anyone else got wind. There were moments when I questioned if I could pull it off. The financial burden, the politics, the sheer scale of it all. But every time I thought about how many neighbors felt powerless under the HOA's rule, it pushed me forward. Eventually, we agreed on a price. Not cheap, but doable. More importantly, it was a statement. I was no longer just a homeowner fighting a fine. I was someone who could change the balance of power in Willow Ridge Lakeside. Someone who could protect the lake for everyone, not just the HOA board and Evelyn's cronies. That's when I realized, sometimes, the best way to fight unfair rules is to own the land they're trying to control. And I was ready to do just that. Once we had the family trustee's interest, the real work began. Buying land isn't like picking up groceries. It's a maze of paperwork, negotiations, and legal hurdles. Mike told me to brace myself. The first step was putting together a solid, clean cash offer. Mike explained that cash offers often carry more weight because they avoid bank delays and complicated financing, which sellers hate. So I gathered the funds, arranged for proof of cash availability, and we put the offer on the table. 2 weeks later, we were still deep in negotiation.
The trustee wanted assurance, clear title, no hidden lien, no legal string attached.
That meant a mountain of paperwork, title searches, surveys, environmental reports, and legal disclosures. Mike and I combed through every document like detectives. Meanwhile, Evelyn's HOA continued their antics, unaware that their grip on the lake was slipping. I kept the deal under wraps. No sense in starting a neighborhood uproar until the purchase was final. The biggest hurdle was the 30 feet of land surrounding the lake. That strip of shoreline was technically part of the family trust's property, not the HOA's. It was a small sliver, but controlling it meant controlling access. Mike stressed the importance of owning that buffer zone to prevent the HOA from arbitrarily restricting residents' use of the lake. If I owned the shoreline, the HOA couldn't block access or impose bans without my consent. Negotiations on price were intense. The trustee was firm, but after some back and forth, we settled on a number that worked for both sides. Then came the paperwork marathon, purchase agreements, escrow instructions, and closing documents. I had to sign more forms than I knew existed, each one legally binding me to the deal. Finally, the closing day arrived. I wired the funds, signed the last papers, and the title officially transferred into my name. The lake and the 30-foot shoreline were mine. It was surreal.
Holding the deed felt like holding the power to rewrite the story of Willow Ridge Lakeside.
No longer just a resident getting fined for fishing, I was now the owner of the very land the HOA had tried to control. I imagined how the tables would turn. I could set new rules, fair rules. Rules that respected homeowners and the environment. I could revoke the fishing ban or enforce it responsibly. I could protect the lake from exploitation or misuse. But most importantly, I could show my neighbors that standing up to power wasn't impossible. The feeling was electric. I called Mike to share the news. He laughed. "Welcome to the Landowners Club," he said. I smiled, knowing this was just the beginning. Because owning the land was one thing. Changing the HOA's behavior was another. But for the first time, I had the leverage. And that leverage would soon change everything. Closing day was a milestone, but it was just the start of what I knew would be a long battle. The moment I held that deed in my hands, the power dynamic in Willow Ridge Lakeside shifted. For the first time, I wasn't just a frustrated resident. I was the legal owner of the lake and the 30-foot strip of shoreline everyone relied on. And with ownership came rights. Rights the HOA had assumed for years but never actually possessed. The very next morning, I drafted a letter and sent it to Evelyn Richardson and the entire HOA board. It was direct, clear, and honestly, a bit of a shock. In the letter, I informed them that, effective immediately, all community access to the lake and shoreline was officially revoked. No more fishing. No more boating.
No more Lakezitstroll.
Nada. The letter cited my new ownership rights and the legal grounds for revoking the prior informal access arrangements. I explained that until a formal agreement was negotiated, one that included fair terms and respect for the residents' rights, the land was private and closed to all. I expected backlash. But what I didn't expect was the sheer silence that followed. Usually, Evelyn was quick to respond with threats, letters, and angry emails. This time, nothing. No immediate response. No calls.
Juste radio silence.
I could almost hear the wheels turning on their side. For years, the HOA had acted as though they owned the lake outright, enforcing rules, issuing fines, and restricting activities without any real legal claim. They'd taken for granted the access to the lake, using it as a community perk but also a tool to control residents. Now, with the ownership in my hands, that narrative flipped. Neighbors who had once whispered about the unfair rules started reaching out. Some were shocked I'd revoked access entirely, worried about losing their weekend fishing spots or family picnics by the water. Others were curious, asking what this meant for the future. I told them the same thing: this wasn't about shutting down the lake forever. It was about resetting the rules, reclaiming transparency, and demanding respect. Evelyn and her board had abused their position for too long. They'd hidden rules, fined residents without clear authority, and bullied anyone who challenged them. If the community wanted access again, it would have to be on my terms. Fair, transparent, and legal terms. As word spread, some neighbors started showing up at my door, worried, hopeful, or just plain confused. A few demanded that I reopen the lake immediately, insisting that the HOA had always managed it well and this was an overreaction. Others quietly thanked me, relieved someone was finally standing up to Evelyn's heavy hand. Managing these conversations was a balancing act. I knew the community relied on that lake for more than just recreation. It was part of their home's value and their quality of life. But I also knew the lake's future couldn't be held hostage by a few people who acted above the law. The next step was clear: open dialogue with residents and the trust, explore cooperative management, and establish clear, fair guidelines that benefited everyone, not just Evelyn's clique. But first, they needed to understand one thing: ownership wasn't just a title on paper. It was power. And power means responsibility. I wasn't going to let the HOA misuse the lake again.
Not on my watch.
It didn't take long for the news to spread through Willow Ridge Lakeside like wildfire. As soon as the HOA members and residents received my letter revoking access to the lake, the neighborhood exploded with chatter, on social media, at block parties, and during weekend barbecues. But interestingly, the fury wasn't aimed at me. No, it was aimed squarely at Evelyn and her HOA. What started as a simple fishing fine against me opened a floodgate of stories from other residents who had faced similar treatment: fines, warnings, and outright bans for the most minor and harmless activities.
Kayaking.
Fined.
Skipping rock.
Fined. Letting kids wade in ankle-deep water? Fined. It seemed Evelyn's HOA had gone on a crusade to micromanage every inch of the lake and shoreline, under the guise of protecting the environment and ensuring safety. Residents began sharing their experiences, many of which involved excessive fines and aggressive enforcement, often without clear explanation or proper notice. Some said they tried to question the fines, only to be met with cold dismissals or threats of legal action. I started hearing from families who felt their outdoor enjoyment was being strangled by the HOA's heavy-handed rules. Retirees who wanted to fish in peace, parents who wished to let their kids enjoy nature, and weekend warriors who just wanted to kayak on the calm lake, all felt trapped under Evelyn's tight control. The community's frustration was palpable. It wasn't just about the fines anymore. It was about losing trust. Neighbors organized informal meetings, sharing legal advice and pooling resources to challenge the HOA's authority. The sense of solidarity was growing. People who had previously kept their heads down were now speaking out. I became a point of contact for many of them, not because I wanted to be, but because I'd taken a stand. And owning the lake gave me a new platform to help them. One evening, at a crowded neighborhood meeting in the local community center, the atmosphere was electric. Evelyn tried to maintain her usual iron grip, but the room was full of angry voices demanding transparency, fairness, and respect. She struggled to justify the fines and restrictions, but the stories from residents were overwhelming. The turning tide was clear: the HOA's heavy-handed tactics had alienated the very people they were supposed to serve. Meanwhile, social media groups blew up with calls to reform the HMWA and reconsider how the lake was managed. I could feel a genuine shift. The community was waking up to the fact that they didn't have to be passive victims of an overbearing HOA. Thanks to the ownership of the lake, I could help lead that change. The neighborhood's uprising wasn't just about access to water or fishing anymore. It was about reclaiming their community, their voices, their rights. Evelyn's reign was facing a real challenge, and the neighborhood was ready to push back. For the first time, the residents weren't just angry. They were united and ready to fight. A few days after the neighborhood erupted, I wasn't surprised when I saw Evelyn Richardson's name pop up on my caller ID. But what did surprise me was that she showed up at my front door just a few hours later, in person, heels clicking purposefully on the walkway, her usual steely glare locked on me. She didn't bother with a polite introduction or a friendly greeting. Instead, she marched right up to me and said, with no room for argument, "You need to reinstate public access to the lake. This whole neighborhood depends on it." I studied her for a moment, the way her jaw was set, the sharpness in her eyes. This was a woman used to getting what she wanted, used to wielding power without question. But I was no longer the scared, quiet homeowner she had bullied before. Calmly, I met her gaze and said, "Evelyn, rules are rules."
Read the deed.
Her eyes narrowed.
The deed?
You don't own the entire lake. You don't have that authority.
I shook my head slowly.
I own the lakebed and the 30 feet of shoreline surrounding it. That's what gives me authority. The HOA only had lease rights. I have the title. That's the difference. She scoffed but didn't argue further. Then she leaned in, voice lowering but sharp as a knife. "You're making a huge mistake. You don't understand the consequences of what you're doing, for the community, for yourself." I responded evenly, "The community will be better off with transparency and fairness, not secret fines and backdoor rules." For a moment, I saw a flicker of frustration cross her face. Evelyn was used to running this community her way, no questions asked. Now, here I was, standing firm, refusing to back down. She tried a different tactic, pleading almost desperate, "We can work something out. But you have to give the community access again."
I shook my head.
"First, we negotiate clear, fair terms. Then we discuss access. Not before." The whole encounter lasted about 10 minutes, short but intense. When Evelyn finally turned to leave, she paused at the gate.
"Mark my word, Mason.
This isn't over." I watched her heels click away and then closed the door. As I leaned against it, I thought about how much the dynamic had changed. I was no longer just a homeowner. I was a landowner, a game changer. Evelyn's usual tactics of intimidation and bullying weren't working anymore. I was standing on solid legal ground, and I intended to hold it. Later that day, I shared the story with Mike, who laughed. "Classic Evelyn move," he said. "Storm in, demand things, try to scare you." But I wasn't scared. I was ready. Because owning that land wasn't just about property. It was about standing up to unfair rules and reclaiming control. Evelyn had challenged me, but I was done being pushed around. The real battle was just beginning. Evelyn Richardson wasn't one to back down quietly. A few days after our tense face-to-face, I received a sharply worded letter from the HNA's attorney. The letter was thick with legal jargon and veiled threats, claiming that my revocation of community access to the lake constituted unlawful interference with the HMA's rights, and that the HMA was prepared to pursue legal action if I didn't reverse course immediately. Reading the letter, I could almost hear Evelyn's voice behind it, the same tone of cold authority and dismissiveness that had made so many residents uneasy for years. But I wasn't worried. Not anymore. I had spent months working with Mike, my real estate attorney friend, meticulously reviewing every document, every clause, every statute that could possibly impact the situation. From the moment I had the idea to buy the lake property, Mike and I had left no stone unturned. We had confirmed, the family trust had clear, undisputed title to the land. The lease agreement the HOA had with the trust was expiring and non-exclusive. The HOA had never held ownership of the shoreline or lakebed. The deed in my name was clean, with no encumbrances or easements that granted the HOA legal rights of access. The HOA had failed to properly notify residents about the fishing ban and other new restrictions, making their enforcement questionable at best. As I read the letter, I felt a quiet confidence settle in. Yes, Evelyn could threaten legal action. Yes, she could try to intimidate me. But legally? She had no ground to stand on. Mike had even drafted a response letter for me to send, laying out the facts clearly and calmly. I pointed out that my ownership was backed by a valid deed, that the HOA's lease was non-exclusive and expiring, and that their threats were unfounded and potentially actionable as harassment.
I sens the letter via certifié mail.
Evelyn's attorney didn't respond for a full 2 weeks. During that time, I heard rumors that the HOA board was scrambling, consulting lawyers, holding emergency meetings, and trying to figure out their next move. It was satisfying to know the tables had turned. Before, it had been me who felt bullied by the HOA, slapped with fines and threats for merely fishing. Now it was Evelyn and her board who were scrambling, unsure of how to reclaim control. I also made sure to keep the community informed. I shared the basics of the legal back and forth, without revealing confidential details, and encouraged residents to educate themselves about their rights. Many were grateful. Some even began questioning the legitimacy of the HOA's other rules and fines. Despite her threats, Evelyn never filed a lawsuit. I suspect her lawyers realized her case was weak, and she couldn't risk losing in court, or worse, exposing the HOA's mismanagement. In a way, the legal threat was her last-ditch effort to intimidate me into backing down. But it had the opposite effect. It only strengthened my resolve. I wasn't going to be bullied or silenced. I was prepared to defend my ownership and my right to protect the lake, and the community, from unfair control. Looking back, that moment was pivotal. It marked the point when the power truly shifted. When a single homeowner, one who refused to accept unfair rules, became a force the HOA had to reckon with. Evelyn may have been president, but the law was now on my side. And I intended to make sure it stayed that way. Evelyn Richardson and the HOA board realized they were losing their grip. Their usual tactics of intimidation and fines weren't working anymore, and my ownership of the lake and shoreline had flipped the power dynamic completely. So in a last-ditch effort to regain some control, and maybe save face, they called for an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was clear: propose a dues increase to fund a leaseback deal with me, the new landowner. The idea was simple on paper but outrageous in practice. They wanted homeowners to pay more, just so the HOA could negotiate access to the lake that they'd previously acted like they owned outright. It was like charging residents to rent back their own backyard. Word of the meeting spread fast. I expected the turnout to be big, but the sheer number of homeowners who showed up still took me by surprise. The community was fired up. People were tired of Evelyn's heavy-handed rule and the way she treated residents like subjects instead of neighbors. The meeting room was packed, standing room only. The air buzzed with anticipation and frustration. Evelyn tried to put on her usual authoritative tone, presenting the proposal as a necessary step to maintain lake access and preserve community amenities. She spoke about responsibility, protection of assets, and sustainability. But the room wasn't buying it. Homeowners took the microphone one after another, voicing concerns about the unfairness of the proposal. Many argued that increasing dues to essentially pay Evelyn's HOA for access was absurd. Some pointed out that they'd already been fined unjustly for fishing and kayaking, activities now banned or restricted. Others questioned why the HOA hadn't been transparent about their limited legal rights to the lake before now. Several residents shared stories about how the HOA's secret rules and heavy-handed fines had hurt families and damaged community trust. I watched quietly from the back, seeing neighbors who had rarely spoken up before now standing tall and demanding fairness. When it came time to vote, the energy was electric. The majority of homeowners raised their hands in opposition. The proposal was soundly defeated. Evelyn's face tightened with frustration, but she masked it with a forced smile and called the meeting to a close. It was clear, the community wasn't willing to give her more power or let the HOA dictate lake access without oversight. The vote was a turning point. It showed that homeowners were ready to reclaim control and demand transparency from their leadership. It also sent a strong message to Evelyn and the board: their reign of unchecked authority was over. The community wanted fairness, respect, and open communication, not secret rules and fines. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me, thanking me for standing up and for owning the land. Many expressed hope that, with new leadership and better management, the lake could once again be a place for everyone to enjoy. I knew this wasn't the end of the story. There would be more battles ahead, negotiations, compromises, and maybe even legal skirmishes. But for the first time, the neighborhood felt united. No longer divided by fear or misinformation. Together, we had pushed back against an overbearing HOA and reclaimed a piece of our community's heart. And that victory? It was just the beginning. With the HOA's threat simmering and the neighborhood divided but restless, I knew I had to take concrete steps to protect the lake and my new property. Ownership came with responsibility, and a certain level of vigilance. The moment I revoked community access, it was clear not everyone would respect the boundaries willingly. The first thing I did was put up fences along the entire 30-foot stretch of shoreline surrounding the lake. Not just any fences, sturdy, well-built, designed to clearly mark the property lines without ruining the natural beauty of the area. It was important to me that the lake still felt like a peaceful retreat, not a fortress. Alongside the fences, I installed private property, no trespassing signs in multiple locations. The signs were clear and professional, leaving no doubt that unauthorized access was forbidden. I wanted to avoid any confusion. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a legal boundary. But I knew that signs and fences alone wouldn't be enough. People love the lake. It was part of what drew many of us to Willow Ridge Lakeside in the first place. I expected pushback, curious neighbors trying to sneak in for a quick kayak or a fishing line cast under the radar. To add an extra layer of security, I hired a weekend patrol service. These weren't some off-the-street guys. They were licensed security professionals tasked with monitoring the lake area on Saturdays and Sundays when community use was traditionally highest. Their job was to deter trespassing, report any violations, and maintain a visible presence to remind everyone the rules had changed. Installing security cameras was the next step. I placed discreet but effective cameras at key access points and along the shoreline. The footage would provide clear evidence if anyone ignored the signs or tried to bypass the fences. More importantly, it sent a message: the property was being watched, and trespassers wouldn't get away unnoticed. I made sure to comply with all local laws regarding surveillance and privacy. The cameras only covered my land and didn't intrude on anyone's private homes. Transparency was important. I wanted to protect my rights without creating unnecessary tension. As word spread about the fences, signs, patrols, and cameras, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood atmosphere. Some residents grumbled, complaining that I was militarizing the lake, turning a once shared community space into a gated fortress. Others expressed gratitude that the lake was now being protected from misuse, vandalism, and unchecked activity. The HNA, predictably, was furious. Evelyn sent several angry letters claiming I was escalating tensions and disrupting community harmony. But those complaints fell flat with me. My goal wasn't to antagonize, it was to safeguard a property I had legally purchased and to set clear, enforceable boundaries where the HOA had failed. I also took the opportunity to reach out to neighbors directly, explaining why I took these steps. I wanted them to understand that my actions were about fairness and respect for private property, not about exclusion or control. Some neighbors surprised me with their support. They shared stories of previous damage around the lake, trash left behind, boats launched without permission, people fishing in unsafe areas, and even unauthorized parties that left the shoreline littered. The fences, cameras, and patrols weren't just about legal protection. They were about preserving the lake's beauty and safety for everyone, including those of us who lived right next to it. Of course, there were still a few who tested the limits: kids sneaking past fences to swim, teenagers slipping in for late-night bonfires. When the patrol caught them, I made sure the responses were firm but fair, emphasizing education and respect rather than punishment. In the weeks that followed, the lake area transformed. The trash diminished, the quiet returned, and the property lines held firm. The community's attitude slowly shifted too, from defiance to cautious respect. Owning the lake meant I had to be proactive. It wasn't just about property rights, it was about stewardship. And with every fence post and camera angle, I was reminding everyone that this land was now mine to protect. It didn't take long for the story to leak out. Maybe it was the fences, the patrols, or the obvious tension bubbling up in Willow Ridge Lakeside. Whatever the trigger, a local reporter caught wind of the situation and reached out. Her name was Jessica, a sharp, no-nonsense journalist who was always on the lookout for community stories that had a bit of bite. I agreed to meet her at the small coffee shop near the neighborhood entrance. We sat in a corner booth, and she fired questions with genuine curiosity but no judgment. "So, you bought the lake after the HOA fined you for fishing? What made you decide to take such a drastic step?" I told her the whole story, How the HMA had fined me $500 for catching two base, how Evelyn Richardson's heavy-handed rule and secretive bylaws made life unbearable, and how I ultimately decided to buy the lake and reclaim control. Jessica listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. She was clearly intrigued by the David versus Goliath aspect of the story, one homeowner standing up against a powerful HOA president and flipping the script by buying the very land they'd been policing. Within 24 hours, the story ran in the local paper's online edition with a headline that made me chuckle: "Man buys lake after HOA fines him, bans entire neighborhood." The article quickly spread beyond Willow Ridge Lakeside. Social media picked it up. Comments poured in, hundreds of people from all over the state, even the country, cheering me on. Finally, someone stood up to a corrupt HOA.
Good for you.
Hope more people take back control of their neighborhoods.
Evelyn Richardson sounds like the worst HOA president ever.
The response was overwhelming. For the first time, I felt like the community wasn't just divided, but that a larger audience was watching and rooting for fairness. Some neighbors who had been quiet before sent messages privately, expressing support or gratitude for shedding light on the situation. Of course, there were skeptics too. Some accused me of being petty or trying to make a spectacle. But overall, the wave of positive feedback far outweighed the criticism. The news coverage put extra pressure on the HOA and Evelyn. Suddenly, their secretive and authoritarian tactics were out in the open. The local reporter followed up with interviews from other residents, many of whom spoke about the years of frustration with the HOA's overreach and lack of transparency. This exposure forced the HOA board to reconsider their approach. The glare of public attention meant that any attempt to bully or intimidate me, or other residents, would now be scrutinized. For me, the media spotlight was a powerful tool. It gave the community a voice, held the HOA accountable, and gave me confidence that I wasn't alone. Owning the lake was no longer just a personal victory. It had become a symbol of standing up against unfair control. It was a reminder that sometimes, the best way to fight back is by shining a light on the truth. The local news story was like a spark in a dry forest. It ignited something that had been smoldering beneath the surface of Willow Ridge Lakeside for years. Once the community saw that one homeowner had the courage to stand up against the HOA's iron-fisted rule, the floodgates opened. Suddenly, it wasn't just me pushing back against Evelyn Richardson's reign. The entire neighborhood began to rally. People who had quietly suffered under her leadership started speaking up. What was once whispered in hushed tones at neighborhood barbecues became open conversation. They shared stories of unfair fines for minor infractions, secret rules buried in convoluted bylaws, and a lack of transparency that left residents feeling powerless. The tension was palpable. Meetings that used to be sparsely attended became packed affairs, filled with voices demanding change. The residents wanted accountability. They wanted a say. And most of all, they wanted Evelyn's grip on the community to loosen. A group of residents, galvanized by the news coverage and my stand, organized themselves. They drafted a petition calling for Evelyn's removal as HOA president. The petition wasn't a knee-jerk reaction. It was carefully worded, citing specific examples of mismanagement, lack of communication, and the recent controversies over the lake access and fines. The momentum grew fast. Door to door, neighbors signed their names. Social media groups dedicated to Willow Ridge Lakeside buzzed with updates, strategies, and words of encouragement. Even some members of the HOA board began quietly expressing doubts about Evelyn's leadership behind closed doors. The cracks in her support were becoming impossible to ignore. The petition was more than a piece of paper. It was a symbol of collective frustration and a demand for respect. For the first time in years, residents felt empowered. Evelyn, of course, wasn't going down without a fight. She sent emails warning about division and instability, trying to rally her supporters. She called special meetings, attempting to discredit the petitioners and maintain control. But the community had tasted empowerment. Her usual tactics of intimidation and gaslighting no longer worked. At the next official HOA meeting, the petition was presented. The room was electric with anticipation. Evelyn tried to dismiss it as a small faction, but the number of signatures told a different story. In that moment, it was clear that the neighborhood was at a crossroads. Residents demanded not just Evelyn's resignation, but a new era of transparency, fairness, and democratic leadership. The fight wasn't just about one woman or one lake, it was about reclaiming the soul of the community. As the pressure mounted, Evelyn's defenses crumbled. She began missing meetings and retreating from public view. The once iron-willed HOA queen was suddenly vulnerable. For the first time, Willow Ridge Lakeside felt like it could truly be the peaceful, welcoming neighborhood it was meant to be. And that, more than anything, was worth fighting for. The mounting pressure had been building for weeks. The petition to remove Evelyn Richardson as HOA president had gathered overwhelming support, and the community's unified voice became impossible to ignore. What had once seemed like an untouchable figure slowly began to unravel. 3 weeks after the petition was presented at the packed HOA meeting, Evelyn surprised everyone by announcing her resignation. The news came as a shock to some, but for many, it was a long-awaited relief.
Evelynès de parture marquette the tendoff en era definet by secrecy, fin and fear.
For years, she had ruled the Willow Ridge Lakeside HOA like a personal fiefdom, wielding her authority with an iron fist and little regard for the voices of the residents. But now, faced with a community no longer willing to tolerate her leadership, she chose to step down rather than fight a losing battle. The announcement came in a formal letter addressed to the homeowners, delivered through the HOA's official channels. Evelyn wrote that she was resigning for personal reasons, and wished the community well moving forward. There was no public apology or acknowledgement of the controversies that had rocked the neighborhood, just a quiet exit. While some residents wanted more closure, many were ready to move on. Almost immediately, the HOA board began to transform. New leadership emerged, composed of people who lived in the community and understood what residents truly wanted: fairness, transparency, and respect. The new board wasted no time in reaching out to me and other key residents who had voiced concerns. Unlike Evelyn's combative style, this group approached the community with an open hand. They asked for dialogue, feedback, and cooperation. One of their first moves was to officially acknowledge the mishandling of the lake access situation. They admitted the HOA had overstepped its bounds and vowed to work on better communication and clearer guidelines moving forward. What surprised me most was how quickly the atmosphere shifted. Meetings became collaborative, not confrontational. Residents who had been hesitant to speak up now felt heard. Issues that had been buried or ignored suddenly received attention. The new board also made it clear they intended to respect property rights, including mine as the lake's owner. They agreed to explore ways the community might enjoy the lake in a responsible and legal manner, perhaps through a negotiated lease or limited access agreements, but only with my consent. That respect and willingness to compromise was a breath of fresh air after months of conflict. Even some of Evelyn's staunchest supporters began to acknowledge the benefits of the change. The community, after all, had been fractured, and healing required moving past old grudges. Evelyn's resignation also inspired a broader conversation about HOA governance and accountability. Residents began pushing for regular bylaw reviews, mandatory notifications of rule changes, and more inclusive decision-making processes. I attended many of these meetings, often sharing my experiences and encouraging neighbors to stay engaged. The lake, once a battleground, was becoming a symbol of community resilience. Of course, not everything was perfect overnight. Trust needed to be rebuilt slowly, and some scars from the conflict would take time to heal. But the trajectory was clear. Willow Ridge Lakeside was on a path toward becoming the peaceful neighborhood I had originally envisioned. Looking back, Evelyn's resignation was a pivotal moment. It wasn't just about one person stepping down, it was about a community reclaiming its voice and asserting its values. For me, it meant that standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed stacked against me, could lead to real change. The lake remained under my ownership, protected and respected, but more importantly, the people around it had started to come together. That was the true victory. After Evelyn resigned and the new HOA board stepped in, things began to shift in a way I hadn't expected. The hostility and mistrust that had defined the neighborhood for months started to ease, replaced by cautious optimism. But one thing was clear: while I owned the lake and surrounding land, the community's connection to that space was undeniable. The lake wasn't just my property, it was part of what made Willow Ridge Lakeside special. I understood that, even though I'd been forced to take a hard stance to protect my rights. So, I was open to finding a way forward that balanced my ownership with the community's interests. It started with a few informal conversations between me and members of the new HOA board. They wanted to mend fences, literally and figuratively, and asked if I'd consider allowing limited access to the lake under strict conditions. I listened carefully. It was clear they wanted to avoid another showdown, and I appreciated their respectful approach. I made it clear from the start, any access would have to be tightly controlled, and I would set the terms. We drafted a plan together, one that aimed to protect the lake's environment while giving residents a way to enjoy the space responsibly. The agreement included several key points: fishing permits. Anyone wanting to fish in the lake would need a permit issued by the HOA in coordination with me. This way, I could keep track of who was fishing and ensure that only responsible anglers participated. Environmental guidelines. We agreed on strict rules to protect the lake's ecosystem. No littering, no motorized boats, catch and release only for certain species, and limits on the number of fish caught to prevent overfishing. Educational materials about the lake's health were to be provided to all permit holders. Supervised access. Rather than open, unsupervised entry, lake access would be limited to certain hours and days, with HOA volunteers or hired staff overseeing activities to ensure compliance with the rules. Written agreement. We formalized everything in a clear, legally binding document. It spelled out my rights as the owner and the HOA's responsibilities in managing access, making sure there was no ambiguity. Drafting the agreement wasn't quick or easy. We had lawyers review every line to avoid future misunderstandings. There were debates over details like the number of permits issued each season and how to handle violations. But the key was mutual respect. The new board understood that their authority didn't extend onto my land without my consent. I understood that the community valued the lake and deserved some access under the right conditions. Once finalized, the HOA presented the plan at a neighborhood meeting. I spoke alongside board members, explaining the terms and why these safeguards were necessary. I emphasized that this deal was a compromise, one born out of conflict but aimed at rebuilding trust. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Many residents expressed relief that the lake would no longer be off-limits, and gratefulness that the HOA leadership had changed course. The permit program kicked off the following month. The HOA set up an easy online system for applications, background checks for fishing knowledge, and clear instructions on lake etiquette. I even volunteered to teach a few informational sessions about responsible fishing and environmental stewardship. Over time, the new arrangement became a model for cooperative community land use. The lake thrived under careful management, and so did the neighborhood spirit. This new deal wasn't just about fishing or access, it was about respect, boundaries, and shared responsibility. It showed me that even the most contentious conflicts could be resolved when people were willing to listen and find common ground. For Willow Ridge Lakeside, the lake was once again a source of pride and enjoyment, not division. And for me, it was a reminder that standing firm on your rights doesn't have to mean shutting doors forever. Sometimes, it opens the door to something better. After the new deal was in place, Willow Ridge Lakeside began to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for months slowly melted away, replaced by a sense of normalcy, and dare I say, peace. Kids were once again allowed to fish at the lake, but now with permits and under watchful eyes to make sure the lake was respected. It was heartwarming to see families return, casting lines into the water with hopeful anticipation, just like they had done before all the drama began. The kayaks came back, too. Paddles dipped into the calm lake waters as neighbors quietly rediscovered the simple joy of gliding across the surface on a sunny afternoon. The once quiet shoreline buzzed with life and laughter, not arguments or fear of fines. The community's relationship with the lake transformed. It became a shared treasure that we all protected and enjoyed. Residents who had been wary or angry now took pride in caring for this natural spot. We formed volunteer groups to pick up litter, monitor water quality, and educate newcomers about responsible use. For me, this peaceful coexistence was a stark contrast to the battles of the past year. I could finally enjoy my property without feeling like I was at war with my neighbors or the HOA. And knowing that the community had taken ownership in a positive way felt rewarding. The HOA itself underwent a transformation. The new board members approached their roles differently. Gone were the heavy-handed tactics and secretive policies. Instead, they embraced transparency and collaboration. Meetings became forums for discussion, not domination. Residents were encouraged to voice concerns and suggest ideas. There was a real sense that the HOA was serving the community, not controlling it. This shift was crucial. For years, Evelyn Richardson's leadership had alienated many, breeding mistrust and resentment. But with her departure and the fresh start, the HOA learned its limits. It became clear that no single person or group could wield unchecked power over a community. We saw greater respect for homeowners' rights and a renewed focus on fairness. Rules were reviewed openly, and any changes were communicated well in advance. The board even invited resident input on key decisions, fostering a genuine sense of partnership. Even small things changed for the better. The landscaping around common areas improved, neighborhood events like block parties returned, and the overall vibe of Willow Ridge Lakeside shifted from tense to welcoming. I often caught myself reflecting on how far we'd come. What started as a frustrating conflict over fishing fines had blossomed into a stronger, more united neighborhood. Of course, not every disagreement disappeared overnight. But now, disagreements were addressed through conversation and compromise, not threats or fines. The lake stood as a symbol of that new spirit. It was no longer a battleground but a gathering place, a source of connection and calm. Seeing kids fish, families kayak, and neighbors simply enjoy the natural beauty reminded me why I moved here in the first place. The peace wasn't just about the absence of conflict. It was about rebuilding trust, respecting boundaries, and creating a community where everyone felt heard and valued. Willow Ridge Lakeside was finally the peaceful retreat I dreamed of. And that made all the struggles worthwhile. It's funny how something as simple as fishing can turn into a full-blown battle for your rights. When the HOA slapped me with that $500 fine for casting a line, I never imagined it would spiral into months of legal wrangling, community upheaval, and a complete shakeup of the neighborhood's leadership. But that's exactly what happened. The HOA tried to control me, from the moment I was fined, right through to when I bought the lake and set the rules on my terms. They thought I'd roll over, pay the fine, and stay quiet like everyone else. They thought the threat of legal action would scare me off. But here's the thing about me, I don't take kindly to injustice. Not when it comes from a group that's supposed to represent the community, not bully it. The HOA, under Evelyn Richardson, had been operating like a dictatorship. Rules were hidden, changes were made without notifying residents, and enforcement was heavy-handed. I quickly realized this wasn't about fishing. It was about power. Every step I took to push back was met with resistance. They doubled down on their accusations about threatening the lake's ecosystem, even though all I did was fish responsibly. They ignored my lawyer's letters pointing out their failure to notify me about the fishing ban. They tried to intimidate me with warnings of legal battles. But intimidation doesn't work on someone who's fought for their rights before. As a veteran, I've faced real battles, and this was just another fight, one I was determined to win. When I realized the lake wasn't technically HOA property, and that I could buy it, the game changed. Suddenly, the HOA didn't have the upper hand anymore. They couldn't fine me for fishing on my own land, and they couldn't control access without my consent. I made it clear, any access would be on my terms. That stung for them. Evelyn and her supporters tried everything to regain control, threats of lawsuits, emergency votes to raise dues for a leaseback, and even attempts to discredit me to the community. But they underestimated one crucial thing, my resolve. I put up fences and cameras, legally posted no trespassing signs, and hired patrols to protect the lake. I wasn't just defending a piece of property, I was defending my rights and setting a precedent for fairness and respect. The neighborhood began to see who was really in the right. The public supported me, and the local news coverage only strengthened that support. Eventually, the HOA's grip weakened. Evelyn resigned, and the new board reached out respectfully. We negotiated a deal that balanced my ownership rights with the community's desire for limited, supervised lake access. Looking back, the HOA's attempt to control me backfired spectacularly. Their heavy-handed approach pushed me to take actions they never expected. Instead of silence, they got a fight. It taught me a lot about standing up for yourself and knowing when to push back hard. Sometimes, institutions forget that homeowners are people with rights, not just dues payers to be controlled. I'm glad I didn't let fear or frustration silence me. Because at the end of the day, this fight wasn't just about fishing. It was about fairness, respect, and protecting what's rightfully mine. And no HOA or anyone else will ever take that lightly again. If someone fines you for fishing, by the lake. It sounds like a punchline to a joke, right? But after everything I've been through, it's a very real lesson I learned the hard way. What started as a simple Saturday morning fishing trip quickly spiraled into a battle over rights, respect, and control. And in the end, it boiled down to one core truth. When faced with unfair restrictions, sometimes the best move is to take matters into your own hands. The story isn't really about fish or fines. It's about standing up for yourself, knowing your rights, and refusing to be bullied by arbitrary rules or power-hungry officials. It's about taking control of a situation when the system around you fails to treat you fairly. I'm not saying everyone should go out and buy a lake. Let's be realistic, that's not an option for most. But the principle holds. When something's unjust, find a way to reclaim your power. Whether that means educating yourself on laws, rallying community support, or consulting experts, don't let anyone dictate your life without challenge. In my case, the HOA thought they could control what residents did on their land without transparency or consent. They hid rules, ignored due process, and tried to intimidate anyone who questioned them. But when I pushed back, I realized they didn't have as much control as they thought. By buying the lake, I didn't just get property, I got leverage. I shifted the balance of power. And with that leverage, I forced a dialogue that wouldn't have happened otherwise. This whole ordeal taught me the importance of knowing your rights and being willing to fight for them. It also highlighted how critical transparency and communication are in any community. Rules and regulations need to be clear, fair, and openly shared. Otherwise, they breed resentment and conflict. On a personal level, I also learned a lot about patience, persistence, and strategy. This wasn't a quick battle. It took months of negotiation, legal consultation, and community engagement. But standing firm and being smart about my approach made all the difference. For anyone else facing similar battles, whether it's an HOA, a landlord, or any authority imposing unreasonable restrictions, my advice is simple: don't back down without understanding your options. Get informed, find allies, and don't be afraid to assert your rights. And if it ever comes down to a fight over something as basic as enjoying a peaceful day fishing, well, maybe consider buying the lake. Because sometimes, owning the problem is the only way to solve it. But beyond the humor, there's a deeper message here. This story isn't just about me or one lake. It's about standing up for fairness in everyday life. It's about pushing back when systems become unfair or unaccountable. It's about being an active participant in your community rather than a passive victim of bureaucracy. At the end of the day, we all deserve respect and the chance to enjoy our homes and surroundings without fear of arbitrary fines or overreach. So yes, if someone fines you for fishing, buy the lake. Or at least, never let anyone tell you that you can't enjoy your own space. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. If you've ever felt powerless against an unfair rule or authority, remember, sometimes the boldest move is the one that changes the whole game. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, because I've got plenty more tales where this came from. And hey, if you've ever had a run-in with an HMA or a crazy community rule, drop your story in the comments. I want to hear what happened. Until next time, keep standing up for what's right, and never let anyone tell you you can't fish in your own backyard.